Good afternoon. I'm Meg Samuelson, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this final conversation panel of Southern Waters. We meet on the shimmering land and sea country of the Ghana people and pay our respects to elders past, present, and continuing. I'm really pleased to be joined on this panel by Killian Quigley, who'll be on the screen behind us, from Australian Catholic University, who's really one of the most interesting thinkers of the undersea today, as well as by my co-researchers in the ARC-funded project between Indian and Pacific Oceans, Reframing Australian Literatures. Chief Investigator Mandy Trigas, Postdoctoral Fellow Madeline Sayes, and Doctoral Researcher Deborah Gavanis. I'm not going to introduce panelists further. Biographical notes are all in the program. We are testing out a conceptual category in this panel that we're calling Bejeweling waters, which is much inspired by Killian Quigley's work on submarine aesthetics and the encrusting ocean. With the attributive verb bejeweling, we name the repertoires of the undersea, or what Killian describes as the habits of the sea, while bringing the undersea as a repository of precious things into the domain of attention, and thus also focusing our minds on the submarine world as a zone of extraction and of slow violence. Things of the sea are, however, often ambiguous, leaking out of the conceptual categories that have been forged on land to grasp and hold dry objects. And of course, withdrawing from view. Enchantment entangles in extractive procedures. Wonderment drifts through the postures of astonishment, admiration, speculation, and speculative capitalism. We're interested in the pressure that Bejeweling waters place on epistemological and aesthetic categories, and in the marvelous things that it invites us to think with. The things that have captured our imagination are pearls and pearl shell, coral and opals. They are things not only of the submarine world, but also of the South. Can I get my first slide up there? The reef-building corals are distributed largely between the 30-degree latitudes, and they are thus to be found mainly at the confluence of the global South. Next slide, please. And the blue southern hemisphere. Next slide, please. This confluence that Sean Lavery and I have called the Oceanic South. Saltwater pearl oysters, in turn, are distributed across the Indo-Pacific. So this is the black-lipped pearl oyster, but the silver-lipped pearls have a very similar distribution, though concentrated more just to the north of us. The vast majority of the world's opals are in turn mined in South Australia, and the second largest source is Ethiopia. Attending to depth and to the movements of diving, sinking, wrenching, surfacing, drifting, and wandering, this panel engages with the immersive turn in the blue and oceanic humanities. But the things that preoccupy us direct the submarine turn into the domain of southern theory and also allow us to follow the sea inland, while returning us to surfaces that are provocatively porous, pearlescent, and iridescent. How this panel will run is something of a mixture of a presentation and conversation panel. So the panelists will give short presentations and I'll call on them in turn. We then have various discussion points to raise among ourselves and also hope to be opening to the audience. So I'm going to ask Mandy to talk to us about pearls and pearling in early 20th century literature.
Hi everyone. I'll just read it. So I'm thinking with pearls and I'm thinking with lagoons and I'm thinking with atolls. While pearls as ornament and pearl shell as clothing in the form of buttons are associated with the feminine and the domestic, one story in the early 20th century pushes back on this understanding as it explores the masculinized process of pearl and pearl extraction. While not overtly critical of external forces that exploit both labour and lagoon in the Pacific, Jack London's The House of Mapuhi is predicated on the fact of those conditions. It was published in various Australian newspapers as well as McClure's in 1909, and the functioning of pearling operations in the Tuamotus are background to what is essentially an adventure tale. And if you have an intention about what the denouement of the story might be, I'm going to spoil the ending, okay? But it's still exciting to read even if you know what happens. The text is set in the Tomato Archipelago on the islands of Hikueru and Takakolta, it's actually Takakolta. The Tomato Archipelago in what is now French Polynesia consists of 76 or 78, depending on who you believe, islands, almost all of them atolls. Now, you probably think you've never heard of the Tuamotus, but you probably have. Two of the most southerly, Mururoa and Whangatapa, were the site of French nuclear testing from the 1960s to the 1990s, affecting over 110,000 people, which was pretty much the entire population of the group. And during these years, the health consequences were quite suppressed by the French government. The Tuamotus are the largest group of islands in the world. At 850 square kilometres, they're about the size of Western Europe. Because of ocean currents, this was often the first place encountered by European explorers, the first of whom was Bejeweling in 1521. In 1722, the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen noticed local Maori making use of pearl shell for pendants, tools and fishhooks, and he speculated on the possible lucrative trade in pearls. When pearling expeditions were attempted from Europe in the early 19th century, they were attacked by the locals. Through the pressures of French colonisation, locals were eventually co-opted into what amounted to, in Moshe Rappaport's words in his written book of history of this, a shell rush in the most distant atolls of the archipelago. This caused ongoing conflict about the central location of pearl shell extraction, the lagoon. Maori complained about a range of practices, the use of diving machines, which sped up extraction, bringing locals from other islands to free dive, as occurs in this story, and the question of who owned the lagoons. There was actually some regulation in play from about 1874, together with recognition of Maori rights, but there was still a great deal of conflict. So that by 1908, George Kuntz and Charles Stevenson wrote that by the late 19th to early 20th centuries, the Tuamotu group of 4,000 fishermen yields in an average season about 450 tonnes of mother of pearl, worth about £65,000 in London, and most of it is marketed. The yield at the remaining French islands is less than that of the Tuamotu, so there were other places. Pearls from the Tuamotu group became particularly famous when the Empress Eugenie wore a string of black pearls from the archipelago. So that's about 1870, and Queen Victoria bought the pearl, which reportedly cost £6,000. So London's story has a pearl at its heart. But despite being an actual pearl of great price, the tale works against the Christian metaphor that faith is a pearl one would sell everything to gain, instead reversing it, as the titular Mapuhi and his family desperately try to sell a pearl to gain a house. The story is punctuated by scales and measures that give it a distinct rhythm and add to its dramatic arc. These scales relate to pearl price and currency, barometric pressure, sea level, and racial taxonomies. Such scales hint at the context in which the story was written. This is the actual island. Without really explicating, the pearl price ranges from 1,200 Chilean dollars, which Chilean dollars were widely used across the Pacific as currency at this time, to 5,000 French francs, and all the way up to 100,000 French francs. The retired Captain Lynch on Hikueru for his health tracks the barometric pressure dropping in steps from 29.70 eventually to 28.20, which is a massive drop, before he's helped up a tree and eventually blown to his death in the lagoon. So there's a hurricane in the story. The sea passes the high water mark, crosses the highest land, and eventually takes trees and climbing buildings, most notably the Morgan Church. Traders Levi, Taliki and Raoul, the supercargo who fails to secure the pearl until it's too late, are described in social Darwinist racial taxonomy as quarter caste, half caste, and Jews. So the tale begins with Marpuli, a diver who's come from another atoll, Whakareva, to work the pearl shell season. He's found the pearl and with his family, wife, mother and daughter, plans to sell it to build a Western style house at Whakareva. And this description is repeated many times. This is another rhythmic motive in the story. It has 4 bedrooms, a porch all around and an octagon drop clock, which were trendy around the turn of the century. The drama comes not just from the transfer of the pearl, but from the force of the storm that strikes the atoll. Hikuera, like most atolls, is low-lying, with land surrounding a lagoon. The storm is preceded by sea surges, which begin to wash across the land, forcing people to tie themselves high in coconut palms to escape it. When the cyclonic wind comes after the sea's risen, many are blown from the trees and fall into the lagoon when the trees snap. Eventually, buildings are washed into the lagoon, which becomes this swirl of dangerous tumbling materials. Others are swept out to sea and drowned in the waves. London describes this in intense detail. This is one of the most dramatic stories I've ever read, with characters we've been following meeting their ends in various ways. London based the storm, with only slight exaggerations, on the hurricane of 1903, which struck Higuera at the time when all of the best divers were gathered for the pearling season there. Hundreds were drowned. London had passed through the northern part of the group of the Humanities in December 1907 on his vessel the Snark, but he didn't stop there. He was on his way to Tahiti. The storm, though, had been widely reported in San Francisco, where he lived. But it's likely that during his stay in Tahiti, he was reacquainted with it. The San Francisco Herald reported that 600 had died across the islands, with 377 on Hikuera alone. Now, late in the story, the narrative shifts. It shifts away from what's happening on this island to what's happening on one to the north, when Nauri, Mapui's mother, was washed up on the beach at Tohokoka, alive but battered and bruised. It's rare to read a grandmother's story. It's rarer still to read a grandmother's adventure. But hers is one of heroism that results in the return of the pearl to her family. So this is a summary of the last part of the story. She finds the pearl on the dead Levi. He's missing his face, but she knows it's him because his hair. And she finds the pearl in his money belt and she ties it around her neck with a scrap of material. She lives on the island for 18 days. She thinks she's going to be rescued, eating coconuts and tinned fish, also washed up in the Flotsam Jetsam. She reconstructs a broken out rigger canoe. She paddles and bails it back to Hikuera, which is 15 miles away. But the current starts to take her away, so she swims the final 3 miles. But then she starts to be surrounded by a shark, and she faces that down. At the start of the story, the family are living in a shack, later described as a grass shack, though following local custom would have been woven coconut. And there was a slide showing someone walking along with their house, ready to be assembled. The first trader, Raoul, questions the usefulness of the house, asserting that the first hurricane that comes along will wash it away, to which Mapuli responds, not on Whakareva. The land is much higher there. On this island, yes, in an authorial nod to the disaster to come. Later, after the hurricane, they are living in a hole in the sand, covered over by fragments of metal roofing with a mat door. While Raoul sees the pearl as precious, it's described as large as a pigeon's egg, a perfect sphere of a whiteness that reflected opalescent lights from all colours about it. It was alive. For Nauri, the grandmother, it held, I'm quoting again, no intrinsic beauty. What she did see was the house. Mapui and Tafara and she built it so carefully in their minds. Each time she looked at the pearl, she saw the house in all its details, including the octagon drop clock on the wall. So, as you probably all know, pearls are made by oysters in response to irritation by an external substance of the sand that lodges inside the shell when it's open, and it's open most of the time for them to eat. The oyster covers the irritant using nacre, the same stuff it uses to build its shell, and it forms a pearl. So the pearl is a byproduct of the oyster's habitation building industry. One might interpret the family's desire for the house as westernisation, a sign of culture changing after exposure to trade and foreign values. But at this stage, imported goods and wage labour are already part of tourism culture. Copper and pearl shell are its own industries. This isn't mimicry, this is life. Just as the oyster lives in the shell of its own making, so Mapuli, Farah, Nakura, and Nara want a safe permanent dwelling. Status is never mentioned, though the plot might hint at the impression such a house might make. It's the materiality of the pearl that gives it force in this story, whether as a thing of great beauty that could be sold for a fortune, or as the means to obtaining a house in an economy that exploited pearl shell divers and put them to debt. The pearl is a means to other things. The biblical pearl of great price is a spiritual possession, lacking in materiality, yet something one would sell all they had to obtain. The pearl in this tale is something one would sell to get something else. In Mapuli's case, a Western-style house.
Thank you, Maggie. We're now going to ask Killian quickly to speak to us about mid-century pearl and coral diving in the Indo-Pacific. Over to you, Killian.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. All good.
Excellent. Thanks. Hello, everyone. It's a genuine honor to be with all of you. I'm beaming in from Melbourne on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to first pay our respects to Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and emerging. Thanks so much, Meg. Thanks so much, all the organizers, for what's been an extraordinary, truly extraordinary event. One that I consider myself really lucky to be a part of. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully now you can see a picture of the cover of the Australian Journal. I want to talk just for a few minutes to start about value and about the ways in which, a few of the ways in which the ocean, and especially the undersea and the seabed, have been and continue to be hailed as repositories of value. I start with this charmingly strange magazine cover of an issue of the Australian Journal from February 1952. In this issue of the Australian Journal, there's published one of two special articles that the writer, critic, and political organizer Jean Devaney wrote about a trip she took to Wanyami, or Green Island, with Bruce and Frances Cummings, who were and still are well known as underwater photographers and videographers in Australia. At the island during this trip, Devaney has access to Bruce's diving bell, a kind of extraordinary opportunity, and she goes diving, as you can glean from the image that we see here. The first time she does so, she's in the diving bell. She describes the following. She says, as she goes under, quote, "I felt acutely alone and lonely at first, but as I was lowered away, the amazing nature of the new experience effaced all consciousness of self," end quote. Okay, so submersion as a kind of engine of maybe an experience that we could call or compare to the sublime, right? Of becoming absorbed, okay, which seems to be doing some really important things for subjectivity. An intensely aesthetic account of what Devaney experiences as she goes under the waves. A little bit later in the same dive, something happens, which I think is arguably more interesting than what I've just mentioned. So Devaney is underwater, and she's got a listening device in the diving bell, through which she can receive communications from above. Frances Cummings from dry land informs Devaney that a, quote, "queer looking boat has arrived in the vicinity of where Devaney is diving. And Devaney, Francis explains, is about to have some visitors. And after Francis sort of informs Devaney of these visitors, this is what Devaney writes. Upon her words, an immense frog-like shadow came splaying down towards me. Then the sea became alive with men, strange men, brown men of a type I had never seen before. One kicked himself up to a window and stared at me through red-rimmed goggles. Solemnly he stared. Another, a large fat man, landed on the sand, dug his heels in with a tremendous shove, worked his arms like a flail, and thrust his face against the glass. Like a cork, he bounced up again. Others followed. Their cheeks ballooned as they stared, tapped the windows, and shot up. I became anxious to go up. Who were these strange men? End quote. So the vessel, Devaney's reader is informed, is a, quote, New Guinea riverboat headed to Cairns for repairs. And what interests me, and what I hope you might find interesting as well about these scenes that I just mentioned, is the disorder affected for Devaney's aesthetic experience of the undersea by the appearance at depth of, quote, strange brown divers. And what I've been trying to think about in some of my work recently is how we might recognize this episode as part of a kind of wider problematic in the representation of seascapes in the undersea, significantly in Australia, I think, but perhaps elsewhere as well, right? Who and what belong underwater. Moving on. As will be obvious to you from the cover that I provided here as a slide, the Australian Journal, in response to Devaney's account, makes the kind of, I think, deeply bizarre choice to simultaneously highlight this episode that's so kind of disruptive to the rest of the flow of Devaney's story, and at the same time to distort it, right? So the figures, the male figures that we see here, remind me, as somebody who thinks a lot about sort of cultural history of the underwater, they remind me of kind of Jacques Cousteau and his colleagues Philippe Taillet and others. And so I'm really interested in the sort of protocols of representation, of erasure, and so on, that may be at work here. Devaney, as I mentioned, publishes another article in this series, and in that one, she gears up for another dive in helmet and corselet. And as Mandy's wonderful presentation has just helped us recognize, helmet and corselet is a diving costume that in Australian settings is inextricably bound up with histories of pearling and pearl shell labor in the wider central Indo-Pacific. As Tanya Edwards, Sarah Yu, and others have so kind of incisively observed, cultures, Aboriginal peoples in Australia's far northwest and elsewhere have developed and sustained cultural relationships with pearl and other shells for at least 30,000 years. And in the Timor and adjoining seas, excuse me, oyster patches, have presented long-standing sort of incitements to transmarine endeavor, or what we might think of as distinctive forms of transmarine cosmopolitanism. For example, as you and Edwards tell us, Aboriginal artworks located in what is now Australia's Northern Territory have been interpreted as representing sailors from Macassar on the island of Sulawesi, sailing to the north of Australia since as early as the 1500s. Right? So thinking with that kind of incredibly deep and cosmopolitan history, thinking with Devaney and the Australian Journal, I just want to say a word or two about an account of the pearl industry that I think is worth thinking alongside these in some really interesting ways. And that is the memoir of the Torres Strait Islander author Thomas Loa, Edad Mer, My Life. And among many other things, Loa's book recounts his time working pearling luggers in the Coral and Arafura seas. And there's a moment in Loa's account that I think, collides with Devani's experience, and maybe also speaks in interesting ways to London and the kind of trope of the pearl adventure in useful ways. So writing against Ian Idris, the Australian author who wrote, among other books, 40 Fathoms Deep from 1947, Loa takes time in his memoir to set the record straight about the idea that a diver might get their foot caught between the shells of a giant clam, which is a scenario that Idris had exploited for a kind of dramatic effect in another of his books. And this is what Loa has to say in this moment of a kind of literary critical moment within Edad Mer. So Loa writes, "From my own experience and that of others, even a blind person could not place their foot in a giant clam because a big one will stand to a height of 30 to 36 inches. A diver's boot would not fit into any that were smaller than this. Anyone at the bottom of the sea with a diving suit on would have to walk the goose step, as the German soldiers do when marching, to get his foot as high as a giant clam, but even that would make it hard to place a foot in." End quote. So through an invocation of what, thinking with Margaret Cohen's work, we might call craft, Loa mobilizes the force of labor and of laboring knowledges to debunk a sensationalizing figment, right? So, what I'm thinking about as I sort of lead us through this are again, the different forms of value that we're seeing articulated, the different forms of value that we're seeing maybe questioned or resisted vis-a-vis these submarine realms. And the last thing that I want to say in this little sort of introduction to the things that I've been working with recently is to think about what do these tensions, right? What do these sort of these different and in certain ways conflicting trajectories in the idea of what's valuable about the underwater, what do they do for our sense of ourselves as researchers, right? As people thinking, working, creating with oceans and the underwater. I'm thinking reflexively of what I think we could call, a number of underwater turns in humanities research of the past little while, turns that are so often justified by people like myself, frankly, as they're justified by way of proposing the submarine as a realm for disconcerting, terracentric sensibilities, spatialities, temporalities, and epistemologies. These claims are often made in epistemological terms and even in ethical or quasi-ethical terms, right? The idea that maybe a submerged humanities is one that treats the notion of a coherent, controlling human subject with a healthy skepticism. One of the ways that this underwater turn is being mobilized, I think, really forcefully in humanities research is through the figure of the researcher as swimmer, or the researcher as diver, and as research going underwater. In other words, the underwater as not only an object of scholarly interest, but of scholarly identification. And I just want to sort of leave us with that to start out. What would it mean to work toward a richer sense of where diver and diving figures have come from and where they haven't come from, of what worlds our sort of sense of submergence has and has not been committed to discovering, and what work we might all be doing to better acknowledge and more plurally acknowledge those worlds, as well as to maybe reflexively consider where our senses where our senses for the undersea are beginning and where they're ending. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks very much.
I'm not giving a mini presentation. We're going to move on very soon, but I just wanted to add to this line of conversation 2 examples from the island of Mauritius. So it's a little bit of Indian Ocean latitude into the conversation. And I want to pick up on the racialization of labour and of pearling with reference to this passing conflation at the start of Conrad's characterization of Mauritius as a pearl. He calls it the pearl of the ocean because it distills much sweetness on the world, and he is referring to the sugarcane plantations. So it's a very sort of interesting figure, of course, of extractive labour, through which the pearl stands in for. And if I can get the next slide. Mauritius was the primary receiving destination of what came to be called coolie labour, over nearly 500,000, largely coming from the subcontinent, but not entirely, and of course other destinations were Fiji, Reunion, and elsewhere. And the colourful images were taken, of people as they arrived, and they've recently been reworked into this very interesting exhibition that was put together by Cal Torabili, who is also a poet. So what's really interesting is that he takes this identity, this denigrated identity of coolie, and turns it into a positive term in similar ways to the ways in which poets such as Césaire from Martinique and Senghor from Senegal performed négritude as a positive identity. But what he does is to contrast the Césaire's black rock of négritude with the figure of coral, which I read as a kind of rewriting of that Conradian pearl, not something that we can extract and adorn ourselves with, but instead an imagery that he describes always as porous, symbiotic, collaborative, negotiatory. So it's a different kind of construction of the labour function and its afterlife. So I just wanted to add that into the conversation, that we are now going to turn to Opals and Theo. That's South Australia.
I'm going to try and introduce Opals as a jewel of the sea inland today. But first I want to acknowledge that I'm meeting and presenting on Ghana country. And I will be speaking today about opal mining regions in Australia that are located roughly near Wallarai and Budgie country in central northern New South Wales and central Queensland. And that the history and stories and knowledges of those places and people are profound. And so I'm taking this chance to imperfectly note that the rationale I'm going to present today for opals as hidden jewels of the sea is very limited and comes from a particular knowledge tradition and is only one of the many ways that we could and must possibly think with southern waters. I also think it's important that I kind of pitch opals with respect to my larger project and why I think they've got a place here on this panel. I'm also going to take some time to do that as well before I start speaking about the text that I've brought along with me. So in my PhD project, I'm trying to figure inland evocations or materializations of the sea and the ocean in the Australian spirit imaginary. The colonial posture towards inland Australia has long approached it as a desolate, dehydrated, oceanless space. And I'm curious as to whether the figure of the sea inland and reading and writing of its various materials may illuminate the exploitative impulse and condition of the settler colony, but also how it might offer alternative understandings of a continent infused rather than merely girt by sea, as Peter McCormack's famous lyrics to the Advanced Australian essay. So despite John Oxley's and Charles Sturt's declaration that Australia features no substantial interior body of water, the geological history of the continent reveals that it did, albeit some 100 million years ago, but it was there, and it is still there today as a sort of liquid shadow hidden in fossils and in the Great Artesian Basin and opals. It was called the Aromaca Sea, and as it retreated, its giant seabed offered a porous surface through which the water could percolate through the sandstone and bond with silica molecules. And in that deep weathering process, we now find these bright flashes of opalescent veins that sit in these lithic fissures. What I think is so fascinating about this jewel, and why I do think it's appropriate for today, is that these southern water molecules actually remain trapped within the jewel itself and give it its iconic flashing appearance. The light reflects through bounces between the molecules, and that's what gives our ability to see this spectrum of colour. I am in the very nascent stages of thinking with this and trying to conceive of it as a chapter in a larger piece of work. So I'm just taking today's opportunity to kind of feel out some of the shining seams. That's the first opal metaphor, and point to where they might take me. So yeah, I brought with me Catherine Susanna Pritchard's Black Opal and Jeanette Turner Hospital's Oyster from either end of the 20th century. One is in Pritchard is published in 1918 and Hospital's in 96. And I want to just bring them to think about how these settler stories use and respond to the jewel itself of opal, the work of opal mining and extraction, and then I'm finally going to pose some questions with regards to the depths as a place to encounter knowledge and reimagine our state of being, as has already been raised by the panelists before. So, in Western or Northern literary traditions, the cultural representations of opal are long centred on its magnificent beauty. John Florio, in his 1598 English-Italian dictionary, is one of the first recorded definitions of opals, and he defines them as a stone which possesses the beauty of emerald, carbuncle, and amethyst, all wrapped in one. More interestingly and curiously for me is the stone's ambiguous association with magic and occultist powers. Mandy mentioned George Coonsberg. He was one of the critics that located the bad luck omen that's associated with opal with Sir Walter Scott's 1829 novel Anne of Geierstein, which I haven't read at all, but I read this is the part that features Lady Hermione, and she always wears an opal head, and when it's touched with holy water, both it and she turned to ash and died. And it's been debated whether this is the sole reason that opal got its bad name, but nonetheless, the Gothic undertones really stuck with it, and the sense that the stone is tied up with the dangers of enchantment and femininity and the supernatural. I see them being rehearsed in these two texts still. So an example from Black Opal is a scene. It's a fantastic, intense scene where we see one of the miners, Michael, who's supposedly the most noble of them all. He goes against his better judgment and takes a look at opals that he's not meant to, he's promised to pass on. And I quote, the colours, as he looks at it, the colours in the stone, blue, green, gold, amethyst and red, melted, sprayed and scintillated before him. His blood warmed to the fires. And in a trance, he then fails to return them. And in Oyster, we see a similar stupefying response from the townsfolk as they look at 3 opals the size of walnuts. Again, I'm quoting, we were mesmerized. Anyone who has been to Cooper Pedy or Lightning Ridge will have no trouble believing this. The devotees of opal will prostrate themselves before its colorific and prismatic silica flames. They smolder with passion, they burn. And so in these just 2 small examples, opal has both, this visually arousing effect and it sparks bodily warmth. And I think it also raises questions about the agency of the stone, vibrancy, the thin power, to use Jane Bennett's term there, about what effect it can have on us. I've also been thinking from Wednesday evening about Gail Jones's reading from her essay Immersion, her reference to the calenture and her use of the word sumptuousness to describe the draw and allure of water. But I also think we see this here with the bodily pleasures that come from this watery gem. And the dangers too, the sense that there's something to fear in that. Gail also quoted Richard's diving into the wreck, reminding us of the treasures, but also the damages that prevail in deep waters. And so I'd like to briefly pivot to think about the work of opal mining. So because although these texts mirror shades of a particular northern tradition which presents the opal as a site for dangerous enchantment, when we draw up these stones out of the earth here in the south, they also flash the shades of the settler colony and its habits of extraction, capital, and ongoing dispossession, which I haven't been able to find some of the other literature from around the place. It seems kind of unique to the way that opals show up here. It's frequently cited, and as Meg mentioned, that Australia produces 90% of the world's opal supply. And it was announced in 1993 that opal is the official national gemstone. And to me, this declaration of ownership signals that the opal has become part of the colony's nation-building process in both a literal and a symbolic way. Richard famously co-founded the Australian Communist Party, and I think she moved in the same circles as Bejeweling as well. I'm not too sure about that, the details of that though. And in Black Opal, she presents a kind of labourer's utopia with all of the romantic trimmings, and in it valorises what small-scale opal mining could mean for the establishment of the nation. It's unashamedly nationalistic, but Pritchard is hell-bent on warning the reader against the threat of labour exploitation and the loss of workers' freedoms. And she explores this in the central plot point, which is the town's negotiation of an eventual resistance to this offer from a wealthy American opal buyer who wants to establish a syndicate there. And so though the text registers an awareness of the exploitative thrust, it also fails to recognise some of the other damages that result from pillaging the debts, let alone the fact that Pritchard has a very narrow sense of who's considered a labourer and therefore worthy of protection. The text entirely lacks Indigenous presence, which is also inaccurate because there are lots of studies and memoirs which show that Indigenous participation in opal mining labour, particularly more so in the start of the 20th century rather than later, was indeed influential. I see Oyster, written almost 80 years after, as an attempt to address some of these emissions. And I won't go into this, but just to say the hospital spares almost nothing in her account of the intergenerational trauma that haunts Adelaide, the name of the town. And through the various narrative voices, she critiques the violence of extraction and land dispossession and colonisation. So I want to conclude by just turning back into the depths and hopefully opening it then back up to the rest of the panel. By considering if opals and practices of subterranean submersion can offer other ways of thinking the relation between the surface and the depths, and also, in this case, the wet and the dry. Like opal's obsession with groundedness, I found so interesting as I was reading. The book shows a real distaste for drifting and fluidity. There's an example where foreign workers are really resisted, and they're described as being irritating factors that wash up in backcountry, and as quickly as they drift in, they drift away again. And this is in contrast to the quite shiftless, unmoving ridge folk who both show the same commitment to their ideas as well. The book itself, in its form, features a very linear structure and a grounded narrative perspective, which doesn't move from the centre of the town. We never leave it. We rarely go beneath the mine shafts themselves. Where in contrast, Oyster is much more at ease with the turbulence. The text flows and ebbs across time. It dives through different spaces. It's constantly shifting narrative perspectives, almost hard to keep up with, and The townsfolk, though they show a resistance to foreigners, the foreigners themselves are represented quite sympathetically. And it's in these moments that Hospital draws us down into the mining pits that she gestures to other ways of encountering the depths, beyond an understanding of them as zones to go into and pull out of. And also beyond an understanding that once we've pillaged and abandoned these mines, that they're just waste, that they're not just these irreparable scars filled with worthless potch, but there's something to be kind of salvaged and repurposed, recycled. And so I'm finally going to conclude by just reading a passage from Oyster, which I think says, touches on all of these things in a really beautiful way, if you don't mind. So this is from a moment where Mercy, the young protagonist at the center of the novel, she goes down to these abandoned mines, and that's where she writes in her journal and she reflects. And at this moment, the Hospital just gloriously brings the ocean back in and kind of collapses time and space, and I think it's really beautiful. So this is Mercy writing, and she says, "Opal is amorphous silica with water trapped inside. The water and the silica diffract the light, and that is why the colours chase each other on the skin of the stone. The water in opal is thousands of years old, so the past is locked inside it, the way meaning is locked inside a word. The mine is abandoned, it has been worked out, but opals still hide there. I have found 3 opalized seashells from 1 million years ago when Adamaru was under the sea. If that is true, the great slow waves of the ocean floor have washed these walls. That is the long history of Adamaru. Our teacher showed us photographs of the Pliosaurus that miners found at Lightning Ridge. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, a great opalized fish that has swum through colour since the world began. It is older than dinosaurs," she said. Thank you.
Now moving to a more focused concentration on ornamentation practices. We're going to start with seeing things that have been surfaced into an ornamental life, and Madeline will talk us through, and then Killian will talk us through things that sink and which are bejeweled by the sea's own habits of incrustation. Thank you, Madeline.
Okay, thank you very much, Meg. I acknowledge the Ghana people as the owners and custodians of the Adelaide Plains, land where I live and work, land that was never ceded. I pay my respects to Ghana elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people. Today I'm speaking about colonial material and fashion cultures in Oceania and Australia in the late 19th century. In doing so, I'm cognizant that Anglo-European and Anglo-Australian fashion appropriated and exploited the material cultures of colonised peoples in these regions, and that the Australian fashion industry was founded on and continues to engage in the exploitation of Pacifica and Aboriginal labour, land and practices. I acknowledge that colonisation continues to be a threat to First Nations material cultures and practices. So this work that I'm presenting today is a small part of what I hope to be a broader project, and was prompted by a fleeting and somewhat puzzling reference I came across in Beatrice Grimshaw's 1907 novel Vitality of the Islands, which I am looking at as part of my work for our ARC-SRI project. But this kind of fleeting reference, I sort of extracted or like mined to use some of this imagery from this text, taking it into the material world. And following this thread led to my acquisition of a small but curiously arresting object behind me, so wearing it today. It's a simple gold ring dating from the late 19th century. It's a very fine band and a collet setting. But the gem with which it's set is what is surprising. It's not a rare stone extracted from the earth, cut and polished with great care, but a shell, whole and naturally lustrous. The asymmetrical convex of its outer surface is dark green at the apex, radiating out in fading, uneven rings of tan brown, white, and orange. Higher on its bottom edge, the shell follows the natural contour of my hand when I slip it on. On its rough inner surface, the shell's tight whirl imprints against my skin. On one side, the shell has the appearance of a staring green eye, and on the other, an etched fingerprint. but I am fascinated by this strange and beautiful object beyond its capacity to solipsistically reflect my researchers' green-eyed gaze and curators' gentle touch back at me. Like an eddy in a Pacific lagoon, the shell's world draws me in and into the ocean from which it originates. Tracing its spiral inwards, I follow the history of the shell from the intertidal zones of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, inshore, into Australian fashion cultures and the aesthetic imagination, and onto the white, wealthy bodies that a piece of jewellery like this was no doubt intended for. I ask, what are the currents and patterns which bring marine objects, such as this shell, into fashion in the late 19th century? How are these objects transformed in this process, and what meanings do they bring with them? The shell's tight world represents the spiraling in towards a close object-oriented analysis of shell jewellery, and a spiraling out into the Pacific Ocean and the wet, fluid and turbulent ontologies of the shell's ocean origins. My examination of this object does both, I hope, situating the shell ring within broader environmental, colonial and fashionable currents. The transformation of the shell from organism to wearable fashionable jewel invites analysis in relation to practices of extraction and immersion, encrustation and ornamentation. In a vitrine in the basement of Sydney's Powerhouse Museum, I found the Vargranda twin for my ring. Nestled in a velvet lined leather case is this 14-carat gold parure, or set of matching jewellery, made by Sydney jeweller and maker of scientific instruments, F. Adelaide, in 1887. Its component locket, necklace and earrings are set with a total of 25 of these same wooden shells. In English, these shells are referred to as cat's eye or pucula, the corneous trapdoor shell of the turban snail or Turbo perfilatus. The turban snail is an intertidal marine creature, a snail, endemic to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean and parts of the West Pacific. Its circular operculum is convex on its outer surface with a bright cream centre and tan brown margins. The flat inner surface has 4 whorls with a nucleus positioned 1/3 of the way across its surface. Once the turban snails have reached the end of their short lifespans, the opercula detach from the columnar muscle and are transformed from living organisms into vibrant oceanic jewels, washed across the Pacific Islands intertidal zones where they bejewel sand and rock pool, or are collected and used as adornment in agricultural practice. These shells are called mataha, meaning door or window in Tongan, and kanohibu, meaning eye or face in Te Reo. In the colonised Pacific of the 19th century, cat's eye operculum, like many marine creatures and products, was collected, taxonomized, and subsumed into colonial scientific and economic systems as artifacts and tradable commodities, through which they then enter the fashionable aesthetic and marketplace as a quote, island curios. Cat's eye operculum was particularly desirable in Australian fashion, with makers such as Adelaide producing fine jewellery in precious metals set with these shells. Adelaide received a prize at the Sydney International Exhibition for making fine shell jewellery. In some instances, operculum are combined with tortoiseshell, pearl shell, and other marine objects in these pieces of wearable art. Extant examples from the late 19th century include rings such as mine, pendants, lockets, bracelets, brooches, stick pins, and hat pins. So what was the fashionable fascination with this common shell? In her 1846 essay, Island of My Own, Anglo-Australian writer Beatrice Grimshaw states that opercula and other shells are all, and I quote, usable in art jewellery of an attractive kind, and are desirable and familiar to buyers of island curios. In fact, she goes so far as to recommend the trade as a viable career for prospective colonists in Oceania, of course completely erasing Pacific people's practices around collecting these shells. Grimshaw's categorisation of the operculum as an island curio, however, to my mind at least, this represents the reason for the popularity and attendant value of this shell amongst fashionable Australians. These shells originate in the Pacific Ocean and intertidal zones, and this is reflected in their forms and structures. They don't reflect kind of exoticized orientalized image of the Pacific Islands as paradise, which was already popular, circulating in white Australian aesthetic imagination at this time. Nor does the way in which they are styled and set in jewellery at the turn of the century construct a kind of typical island aesthetic the way we see circulating in other aesthetic forms at this time. In their origins and their forms, the shells evoke the rock pools, eddies, and submarine aesthetic of the Pacific Ocean's intertidal zones. Examples such as Myrene and Adelaide, Peru, cat's eye operculum are simply set in a collet style, which frames a convex green surface outwards and recesses the flat whirl against the wearer's body. And this kind of cut would typically be used for some kind of jewel with which you wanted light to come through in order to reflect and diffract light, but obviously a shell is completely dense, it doesn't require this. To my mind, this design is intended to display and emphasise the operculum's characteristics as a shell, suggesting that this is central to its appeal as a wearable jewel. Its evocation of the intertidal and the oceanic is part of its appeal. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, marine products in the forms of pearls, coral, shell, and seaweed were collected and taxonomized by professional and amateur scientists. Catherine Anderson argues that for collectors, these marine artifacts, quote, evoked a particular set of intellectual and cultural ideas about geohistory, the nature of organisms, and the tropical societies where coral reefs, for example, were most common. By collecting these objects, these concerns, and I quote again, were brought imaginatively down to earth, where they could easily be stroked by the fingers or held on the palm. When viewed in relation to colonialism, this practice provided a way for European and white Australian collectors to obtain and study objects from the distant and exotic, quote unquote, places over which they sought to claim some kind of ownership and control, and through which, in the process of othering, they sought to understand and define themselves and their cultures. These effects become heightened when the marine objects are not merely stroked by the fingers or held by the palm, but are transformed into wearable jewellery and fashion, put onto the body and absorbed into gendered colonial embodied identities. The wearing of clothing and accessories is, after all, one of the most intimate sensory and embodied ways of performing identity. In theorising a more than wet ontology for thinking through and about the nature and function of the ocean, Philip Steinberg and Kimberly Peters state that the ocean exists inshore, above ground, underground, in our senses, and as part of fantasy. I contend that the fashion of Pacific shell jewellery in Australia at the turn of the 20th century brings an oceanic fantasy onto bodies and embodied identities, representing what Steinberg and Peters refer to as the ocean in excess. Although cat's eye operculum jewellery is not the ocean as we know it, wet, liquid, visible matter, it is the ocean, an authentic manifestation of more than wet excess, which connects the foreign space of the ocean to the most intimate forms of corporeality. The wearing of shell jewellery represents the commodification and collection of the ocean and its absorption into Australia's imagination, identity, and fashion cultures. It also speaks of Australia's development as a colonial power and an economic and fashionable centre of the South during this period. The adornment of the body with shell jewellery is a process of immersion in the ocean as well as one of extraction from the ocean. It represents a simultaneous desire to commodify and collect the ocean and bring it inland, and to dissolve the dressed body and its embodied identities back into ocean waters, to achieve, in William Wordsworth's words, mysterious union with the sea.
Thank you, Madeline, and back over to Killian on the sea's habits of incrustation.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Before I share my screen, I just want to iterate. I mean, this conversation is already so exciting. Madeline, that image of the conchologist is extraordinary. It makes me think of what you say about what's happening with gender in that image seems so right to me. It makes me think of this really strange passage in Rousseau, where he recounts visiting an old friend who he claims is suffering from what Rousseau calls conchiliomanie, that he's fallen into a state of seeing shells everywhere. So I'm interested in what it would mean if we took seriously the idea that a kind of Shelley or otherwise marine aesthetic, took over one's kind of faculties. And Theodora, I'm fascinated by so much of what you were talking about. Those opalized fossils in particular, like I'd be so keen to hear you say more about those because they seem extraordinary. But departing actually from what Madeline was saying about the ocean in excess, and the ocean articulated differently, as Peters and Steinberg talk about. I'll just say a few words about some work I've been doing recently on incrustation. So sharing screen. And there we are. So hopefully there you can see an image of the wreck of the USS Monitor, which is a US American Civil War era ironclad warship, which lies off the coast of what's called in US American parlance, North Carolina. A little while ago, I was invited by my dear colleague, Kauri Nagai at Kent in the UK, to contribute a chapter on shipwrecks to a book on maritime animals, ships, species, stories. And as I began thinking about shipwrecks and animals, I suppose I should say as well, as a diver, as somebody who enjoys diving on shipwrecks, I found myself thinking more and more frequently of marine invertebrate animals and their relationship with wrecky space. And there are a whole variety of reasons that I won't sort of ramble on about why I think invertebrates are really interesting. In this case, I decided to write about the sponge, or the relationship between marine sponges and shipwrecks. Ultimately, I found myself, though, kind of unable to think about sponges and shipwrecks and thinking more towards something that I called somewhat wonkily the spongy wreck, thinking about the ways in which an object, a scene like you see here, presents us with something that will refuse the sort of disarticulation of the human artifact, the invertebrate animal, and of course on and on and on. One of the reasons that I thought that this sort of thing might be worth thinking about was because it seemed to me to put a bit of pressure on the idea of telling stories with marine animals or telling stories with marine places. Meg brought up corals and symbiosis, right? Perhaps the idea of kind of coral holobionts, the idea that, again, disentangling, say, a coral polyp from the rest of its commensals leaves us with a really kind of reduced sense of what's happening in the world. Sponges, I was kind of bewildered and also charmed to find out present their own kinds of provocations in this way, right? From the fact that they're morphologically promiscuous, right? That they pose all kinds of problems for the forms of taxonomic identification that Western natural history might be used to dealing with, and moreover, they're known for doing things like taking into their bodily structures bits of things from their environment, including structures from other sponges. Where I'm going with this is to say that as I was thinking about storying with sponges and shipwrecks, I found it really hard to think about what the sponge subject was and how I would begin to write about that or think about that, let alone write about it. And so the gambit that I sort of made for this piece and the idea that I've been working a lot with since then is that as well as, or perhaps instead of story, that form provides us with an interesting way of describing engaging and learning with things like this, and indeed other things at the seabed. In saying that, I don't mean to suggest that form presents us with a kind of an innocent language, that it gets us out of problems that narrative might present, but that I thought it might provide some useful opportunities for what's going on. As you can tell, or as you'll understand already, encrusting forms and forms of encrustation became one imperfect way of thinking about this. In my research for this work, I'm constantly running up against strange objects that have been brought to shore from shipwrecks through salvage, a process that's so important, that I take to be so important to everything we're talking about today. And I've become increasingly fascinated by the way that objects like the one you now see on your screen live and work in the context of collection, exhibition, and display. So this happens to be from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It comes from a salvage operation that took place in the late 90s off the southern coast of Vietnam, a place called Kamau. The wreck is called the Kamau, of an 18th century Chinese ship carrying, among other things, porcelain. Okay, so intriguingly, the object name that the Victoria and Albert Museum, among some other museums, gives for this thing is a sea sculpture. And this is the object description that accompanies it that I've got up on the screen. I'll read it out. So it's, quote, underglaze of cobalt blue decorated porcelain pieces fused together by fire with encrusted shell and coral growth. That fire being the one that's reckoned to have occasioned the shipwreck. And what I became interested in, and what I have been interested in with this object and others, here's an object from the Western Australian Museum, the Batavia, are the ways that a kind of syntax of curation and exhibition figures the relationship between, let's say, a human artifact, the trace of human history, and the kind of more than human, spongy and sort of infinitely other, as well as, of course, what we might call inanimate or inorganic processes of the seabed, how the syntax of curation and exhibition organizes those things. So in the case of this piece of lead, that is the object name given by the Western Australian Museum with no other object description, or in the case of the sea sculpture that I've just shown, one of the things that I became sort of concerned with is the way that with things like these, which so vividly, kind of spectacularly register ecofactual as well as artifactual identities, oceanic articulations and oceanic excesses and so forth, we're nonetheless continuing to mostly think of these fundamentally in terms as sort of the traces of human events, right? In a particular kind of what, thinking with Sharon Lavery's talk last night, we might call a sort of teleological time. And so recognizing encrustation and the encrusted as this totally contingent and perhaps in some ways kind of unhelpful way of thinking about things, I became really interested in what we can do with encrustation. I mean, if we take encrustation seriously and we think about an object like this one, for example, as layering times, layering histories, bearing the traces of plural relationships, how might that not only lead us to telling some more interesting sort of stories with objects like these, but how might that also disrupt some kind of tenacious conventions in Western aesthetics and also Western epistemology, which tend, as we've begun to hear already today, which tend to sort of reduce the ornamental or the decorative to something excessive, right? To something something that is superfluous to the kind of the central value of whatever object is in question. Another word that I've been thinking a lot with in the course of this work, which I'll just mention briefly, is concretion, which is a term of art in maritime archaeology, in medicine, and in other areas, comes from the Latin concrescere, for to grow together, and refers to something a bit more dynamic than the kind of substrate encrustation relationship that I've been talking about so far. That is concretion as a kind of, as a bidirectional relationship of encrustation and corrosion, right? And here, to think about another kind of exhibitory context, is an image from the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco, from an exhibition called Lost at Sea, which ran until quite recently. And shouts out to the Asian Art Museum for really kindly providing these images. What we have here, as what I like to think of as the kind of centerpiece of this gallery, is a concretion, okay? And what's so fascinating to me, there are a couple of things that are so fascinating to me. So first of all, formally and aesthetically, it seems to me that this is a really challenging thing and a really challenging image. And I think, to their credit, the Asian Art Museum calls this a concretion. Its object description enumerates the things that are taken to make it up in what almost comes to feel like a kind of postmodern poetic litany. So on the one hand, I'm really excited by the ways that certain practices in curating the sea seem to be thinking a bit harder. On the other hand, I mean, one of the things that's remarkable about this thing is, as the Asian Art Museum explains, it is having been exposed to air in the process of breaking down. That is to say, the kind of what they refer to as the non-artifactual matter is breaking down. And the idea here being that eventually the artifacts, the, as it were, anthropic objects will, quote, come out of concretion, right? That the concretion will cease to exist, and the objects that, I suppose, remain the central focus of concern will emerge, will be disclosed. Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot lately, and just to say in closing, about how thinking through form in some of the ways that I've begun to sketch here might provide some useful, again, always imperfect, to come back to something that Theodora was saying, I think so kind of eloquently, always situated, right? Always coming from somewhere, like thinking through form, about relationship, about oceanic articulations and so forth, might be an entree into some, somewhat fuller, somewhat more ethical, and somewhat more epistemologically productive ways of thinking about what's happening underwater and with the ocean's excessive objects. So I hope I didn't ramble on too long there. I'll unshare and close my mouth.
One of the things we found so interesting in your work, Killian, is also how you take us to the ways in which thinking to the undersea disrupts tendencies also in Western epistemology to prioritize the sense of sight. And the work you do around, I think, visibility under pressure, which is both, I suppose, to return to the point of opacity that we touched on earlier in relation to rivers by Glixon, but also to foreground, I suppose, that the multisensorial nature of immersion. And there's something about those encrusted objects that one has to, in a way, move around and engage us in different kinds of ways that perhaps still continue to put the regime of invisibility under pressure, even when we are looking at them once they are surfaced, that we create a kind of disorienting visuality. We have about 5 minutes, and unfortunately we've got a lot of things that we wanted to still talk about. Can I just ask the panel whether there are any questions you still wanted to pick up at the remaining time, because we did want Killian to also talk a little bit about the underwater museum of Townsville, which is the first construction of this large body of work in the Southern Hemisphere. So we're quite interested in the fact that it has now come down south and that'll be our last, our closing points. We won't be taking questions, unfortunately, but I think we've got a lot to think about. This panel's been a little bit overlished, you know, lots of birthdays and flashes of light, and we can just go off and think about them afterwards and see how they connect. Over to you, Killen, for a last.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I'll just say that I can't wait for the next time we all get to talk together, because I think we have a lot more to talk about, and I remain really grateful. Yeah, so happy to say a little bit, sort of speculatively, about Jason de Caris Taylor and the coral greenhouse. I say speculatively, partly because I haven't yet gotten to go there, right? This is partly about living in COVID times, and partly about other things too. I do have a little picture of it, which I pulled from the web. Hopefully you can see that. So as many people will know, you know, Jason de Caris Taylor is this English sculptor who's become world famous for his so-called underwater museums. There's so much to say about them, and I don't want to ramble, but I guess I'll just say maybe just two things, like to note two things. Like, one of them is that I think it's right to say that de Caris Taylor and his collaborators understand what they're doing as explicitly kind of a sort of ecological labor. So whether in terms of providing habitat, which I think the image here sort of suggests, and or by, and this is sort of interesting thinking about aesthetics, creating sort of curiosities underwater that divers will be drawn to, and therefore drawn away from, as it were, natural habitats that they might be sensitive for various reasons, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. The other thing that I'll just say about de Caris Taylor is that for folks in the oceanic humanities and the blue humanities, however we'd like to configure that, his work has been productive, I think. Scholars like Valerie Law-Shaw, scholars like Elizabeth de Lowry have done a lot with thinking about the ways that de Caris Taylor's sculptures provoke us to think differently about temporality and history, among other things. So someone that people are thinking with quite a bit. What kind of intrigues me most about a work like the Coral Greenhouse is wondering how we can think about it as part of, and I think this is implicit in what I was saying earlier, and I think, without meaning to overstep, I think it's also relevant for a lot of the great talks that we've been hearing over the past little while. That what if we thought about something like the Coral Greenhouse in a longer history of figuring the undersea, and particularly the seabed, as a space of display or as a space of exhibition? It's not only, it wasn't yesterday that we became interested in the idea, thinking about bejewelment, right? That at the seafloor there existed, or there might exist, sort of extraordinary spectacles, right? Many of which function through bejewelment, also transmogrification, right? Uncanny forms of
Levels 1 and 2 of the library will close in 15 minutes. After this time, students are welcome to continue to study on level 3 and in Half Central. If you wish to borrow any items, please take them to the self-check machines located near the level 1 and 2 exits. Thank you, and we wish you a good evening.
No, that's totally fine. I thought, but I thought I should pause in order not to get drowned out. So yeah, so what does it do if we think about, what does it do to our understanding of efforts like these, which I take as as some of the more prominent signs of efforts that are happening at larger and larger scales around the world? What does it mean if we think about these in terms of these longer histories? And what do we think, what happens when we think about them as part of the ongoing cultivation of the seabed as a place for going to view things, to experience things, to interact with formally and aesthetically provocative scenes, objects, and ecosystems. I think what Caris Taylor's work invites us to do is recognize the ways that that we've been doing this, for a very long time, and open some spaces for a kind of critical ocean studies of the seabed that maybe reckons a bit more strongly with these histories, with the histories of diving we talked about earlier, and with the vexing aesthetic, the vexing histories of marine aesthetics, particularly, but not only, in settler colonial contexts that my colleagues have been talking about so eloquently. So I hope those are a couple of okay words there, Meg. Just a couple of notions. I hope we all get to go swimming there sometime. I think that would be really, really the best.
Yeah, absolutely. Kelly, I love the way you brought it all back to and tied up all the threads for us. Thank you. We absolutely need to get you over to Adelaide. We went for a little river walk, but we need to go into the sea next time. So yeah, hope to be hosting you in person. We've got a lot more to talk about, and I think it's been a fantastic, generative, starting a conversation panel. Thank you very much for me, and thank you.